Nuclear Warfare Policy, Cold War to Today, Part 2. Presidential Directive NSC-59, Evolving Nuclear Strategy, July 1980. Quote, "What you need to do if you want to have an effective deterrent is to get into the mind of the Soviet leadership, figure out what they value, and hold it at risk." End quote. Frank Miller, Special Assistant to the President, National Security Council, Defining the Countervailing Strategy. PD-59, NSC-59. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, has openly stated that he has modified the Russian nuclear doctrine and use, posing it as a threat for all intended purposes. Like Russia and the Soviet Union before it, the U.S. regularly modifies its national nuclear policies to adapt to evolving geopolitical situations, new technologies, and available weapons. History demonstrates that implementing such a significant change in a nuclear doctrine is not as simple as it seems, and it would require more time than the duration of a Russian press conference. President Carter initiated a change to the U.S. strategic doctrine in 1977, and by 1980, his administration had largely completed it. The history sheds light on the validity of the Russian doctrinal change. Was the Russian doctrine created after the start of the Ukraine war? Or was the current threats made by President Putin already included in an existing document prior to the war? The Carter administration's changes to the American Strategic Force Doctrine offers valuable insights into the rapid completion of current Russian changes as claimed, given that nuclear policy necessitates numerous downstream changes. President Carter in August 1977 created Presidential Directive NSC-18, sometimes referred to as PD-18. This document classified under the subject heading, quote, U.S. National Strategy, end quote, dedicated half its content to U.S. strategic nuclear forces. The directive merely summarized the direction of U.S. defense policy, instructing various administration leaders to establish working groups to formulate detailed plans for implementing the national policies outlined in PD-18. One of the directions of PD-18 was to update the U.S. nuclear policy from one that was based on mutually assured destruction, or MAD, to creating options for fighting and winning a limited nuclear war. President Carter signed Presidential Directive NSC-59, or PD-59, on July 25, 1980, providing further details of the nuclear targeting policy outlined in PD-18. The work of nearly 3 years provided clarity on how the U.S. was approaching how to fight a nuclear war. PD-59 did not invalidate the U.S. policy of MAD and the need for nuclear parity with the Soviet Union, referred to as nuclear equivalency. But it was meant to give the commander-in-chief more and flexible options over general nuclear war. In it firmly stated that U.S. strategic nuclear forces were to serve as a deterrent in both nuclear and conventional warfare realms. The directive outlined the following guidelines for implementing PD-18's strategic force objectives. 1. Use strategic nuclear forces must deter nuclear attacks against the U.S., U.S. overseas forces, and U.S. allies. 2. The U.S. strategic nuclear forces serve as a deterrent against non-nuclear attacks. 3. Strategic nuclear equivalency, or MAD, is still a valid policy. Subquote, if nuclear deterrence fails, victory is to be denied to the adversary, and the U.S. forces must be able to fight successfully to preserve the ability to negotiate an end to the fighting on terms favorable to the U.S. 4. U.S. strategic nuclear forces employment must relate to conventional force missions to meet national policy objectives as determined by the National Command Authority. The section of the directive outlines the purposes of the strategic nuclear forces, reaffirming that MAD remains a legitimate nuclear strategy that has been in place for over a decade in 1980. Force equivalency is a primary component of MAD in that strategic nuclear warheads between the U.S. and Soviet Union must remain in relatively identical numbers. Nuclear equivalency was the key to the view of deterrence in a MAD nuclear-based policy. If the number of warheads between the two sides were to become out of balance, it could be viewed as giving the other side an advantage in initiating a general nuclear war due to the ability to inflict more damage, thus create an opening of having nuclear advantage due to the balancing of strategic forces favoring one side over the other. This could encourage the opposing side to launch an attack given their numerical advantage and the potential for a first strike, thereby enhancing their chances of a, quote, victory, end quote. Maintaining strategic balance is crucial for effective deterrence, and it illustrates how the MAD doctrine can trigger an arms race by increasing warheads to gain an edge or bridge a perceived gap. Balance of the force, or equivalency, is what is deterrence work in this nuclear doctrine. The points of denying victory to the enemy and support of non-nuclear forces were part of the evolving strategy that was meant to provide the president flexibility on how strategic forces were to be used beyond just simply relying on MAD. While the force equivalency remained valid, the use of strategic forces could expand beyond the mere nuclear spasm of a general nuclear war. While President Carter's views on this matter were not entirely new, he made significant advancements by transforming U.S. strategic nuclear policy and targeting to a limited nuclear war. He set specific goals to establish an escalating option to nuclear war, enabling an adversary to engage in negotiations to resolve the conflict before fully committing all nuclear forces. This directive made the concept of a limited nuclear war another available option for the president. The MAD doctrine included target classification, so the concept was not new to PD 59. However, it introduced of attacking certain target classifications, either in whole or in part, to create favorable conditions to end the conflict or to evaluate continued escalation of attacks. The strategic nuclear targets still fall into the following high-level categories. Counterforce, which involves focusing on the nuclear forces of an adversary. Striking these targets erodes the enemy's capability to launch its own nuclear attacks. 2. Countervalue, which is a strategy that involves targeting the enemy's cities and civilian populations while also considering the economic factors of production in these sites. The new one, 3. Countervailing, involves targeting the enemy's most valuable targets used to maintain military and political control over the country. Prior to the Carter administration, target classifications such as counterforce and countervalue were already in place, but he introduced the additional flexibility on how to attack and reduce each of these targets. Countervailing was a novel classification that was based on determining what the Soviet leadership needed or valued most within their society and making them the priority targets in a limited nuclear war, to create both another level of deterrence and to incentivize an end to the nuclear exchange on terms most favorable to the U.S. Countervailing is dedicated to the following targets: command and control capabilities, military forces, both nuclear and non-nuclear, industrial facilities, and political leadership. President Carter stated that upgrading the U.S. strategic nuclear forces was necessary to make countervailing a successful deterrent and targeting strategy. The primary capabilities to make countervailing successful were C3, command, control, and communications, as well as intelligence to identify targets and to conduct bomb damage assessment. The capability did not only need to be built and functional enough, it also had to have the protection and redundancy to withstand a counter-force attack from the Soviet Union. countervailing is the primary factor that enables the limited nuclear war to transform a doctrine, providing an incentive to establish conditions that could force an end to the conflict before the action-reaction cycle escalates into a general nuclear war. A successful countervailing attack will erode both the will and the capability of the enemy to continue the war, as they would already be at a severe disadvantage. It could incentivize a negotiated settlement on terms favorable to the U.S. The argument against countervailing is that unless it is part of a counter-force attack, the Soviet Union would still have the strategic nuclear forces and could initiate a counter-value attack against helpless populations in the U.S., which would most likely mean that the counter-value attack by American bombers and submarines against the Soviet Union. Targeting the political leadership could potentially weaken the Soviet Union's command structure, but could it also hinder their ability to negotiate a resolution to the conflict? Or, if the political power is more important than its people, would it incentivize the Soviets to commit to a general nuclear war, as they would have nothing to lose? Future articles will cover in the next few weeks. We'll continue more exploring PD-59 and how it shaped U.S. strategic nuclear doctrine.